last but certainly not least, we have Kurt Dolgoski, Tipo for Zuni Pueblo in the Southwest region. And I've also asked him to actually introduce Walter Echo Hawk. So this works out great. We don't have a break scheduled, but of course, since we're virtual, we don't have to worry about squeezing out between people and not getting a chair when we get back. So obviously take breaks as you need them. And we will turn it over to Kurt. Welcome back to the board.
Morning, thank you. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. I've been a Zuni Tipo since 2008. In my position, I'm also the principal investigator for the Zuni Cultural Resource Enterprise, which is a for-profit cultural resource management firm that was established by the Pueblo Zuni Tribal Council in the mid-1970s. And the business has been active since then. And personally, about me is that I'm an Anglo, and I've been doing archaeology for 43 years. I've been involved with tribal consultation for the last 30 years. In 1991, I became the tribal archaeologist for the Hopi tribe and represented the Hopi tribe in consultation for 12 years, where I left in 2003 and then came over to Zuni and was a project director in the Zuni Cultural Resource Enterprise for about 5 years. And then I became the principal investigator and the Tipo for the Pueblo Zuni in 2008, a position I still enjoy to this day. Being the Zuni Tipo because I have an archaeology background, talking and interacting with Zunis was a real enlightening experience for me. And I've tried to incorporate it into the work I do as a Zuni Tipo. For example, in the last several years, I've been advocating, or for the last 10, 12 years, I've been advocating that mitigation of archaeological sites using standard data recovery research designs that are developed by archaeological contract firms and are easily implemented by federal agencies, because that's an easy way to do mitigation, does not consider the psychological, the emotional, or the spiritual and personal connections that the Zuni people have to these places. For Zunis, the archaeological sites are the homes of their ancestors, and they also mark the Zuni connection to the landscape because they have once resided in those areas and still have a connection to those areas on their landscape. The Zuni ancestors still reside at those places, but in a spiritual form. And so when Zunis approach archaeological sites, they then request permission to enter onto the homes of the ancestors and ask for guidance from the ancestors. All of Zuni ceremonial life during the year is geared towards maintaining this relationship with the ancestors. And so to just do mitigation through traditional Western archaeological science is to completely ignore and disenfranchise Zunis and other tribal people from the mitigation process, from having an equal voice in the National Historic Preservation Act preservation process. So we've been advocating for that, and it's been hard because we've got a lot of pushback. There's a lot of economic and political adherence to the normal way that mitigation has been practiced in the past, continues to be practiced. We are making some headway. For instance, for the last 10 years, we've been involved in the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project, which is a pipeline that goes from the San Juan River across the Navajo Nation down to the city of Gallup, but it also feeds most of the Navajo communities along that route. It's part of the Navajo water rights to the San Juan River. And so he's been involved with that. And the Bureau of Reclamation, who is the agency for the project, has began traditionally going to the old style of mitigation of just hiring archaeological firms to excavate archaeological sites and not consider the Zuni association to these places. And the reports that archaeologists write, the narratives, are a third-person narrative about how they envision the past, and they make no recognition of the Zuni connection, the Zuni heritage, the Zuni history that's tied to that landscape. And so even through the archaeological reports that are generated by the mitigation process and the compliance with Section 106 disenfranchises Zuni from their own heritage. And so we advocated that there needs to be accountability by the federal agency to descendant communities, and how does the mitigation benefit the descendant communities. So after many years of discussions with the federal agency, the federal agency is now willing to consider other mitigation strategies that are more meaningful to descendant communities. And some of the things now that we're talking about with the Bureau of Reclamation is developing video that demonstrates the Zuni ties to the San Juan Basin, which would also talk about how the San Juan Basin figures in Zuni history from their emergence in the Grand Canyon through their migrations to Tijuana, where they are now at the Pueblo Zuni. Another one is to develop a coloring book using Zuni artists representing the Zuni relationship to the San Juan Basin and its ties to the migration history, but it's represented in Zuni images and Zuni sensibilities. And the coloring book would be, the images would be drafted by Zuni artists with Zuni captions in Zuni. And this would be a coloring book that would be negotiated between the Zuni artists and the Zuni religious leaders. And the point is, the coloring book is to be distributed among the Zuni community so that the Zuni community, children, can learn about their connection to the San Juan Basin, but also some of the broader Zuni community that may not have that history, that understanding, the connections to the San Juan Basin. Another recommendation is the creation of a Zuni traditional natural resources guidebook, which talks about the natural environment of the San Juan Basin, including the plants, animals, minerals, landscapes, and landforms. And this guidebook would identify elements of the natural environment through the Zuni English and Latin designations and provide photographic illustrations. And another aspect is to have Zuni elders and knowledgeable Zuni leaders involved in the analysis of artifacts that are recovered from archaeological excavation, and actually being involved in providing archaeologists with interpretations of the features that they're excavating, and how we can get a Zuni and other tribal interpretations of the past more commensurately integrated with what archaeologists generate, what then becomes the accepted prehistory of the past. And we also advocate having commensurate consideration of Zuni perspectives to the natural environment. In the natural environment, they relate to the living beings in the natural environment as part of the NEPA analysis, and not have NEPA analysis just be solely focused on a Western science perspective of the environment, where humans are not a part of the environment, to understand what stewardship means and what this relationship to the natural environment means for Zunis, and how the federal government has a trust responsibility to take that into commensurate consideration when they're doing NEPA compliance and compliance with NHPA. So thank you. Thank you for listening to me.
Real briefly, Kurt, this is Shasta. We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. You're really breaking up. So I don't know if you're on your phone or if maybe you could readjust your mic.
I knew how to do it, I would.
Yeah, we can barely hear you. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and introduce Mr. Echo Hawk, that would be great. I think we can hear you enough.
Well, I'll try to speak louder.
It's not the loud; it's more of the static.
It's really staticky, and I don't think it's getting better. So, Kurt, we would like for you to do your introduction, but then we may repeat a little bit of what we heard.
Sure. Thank you.
All right, go ahead.
Well, I'm really honored to introduce Walter Echo Hawk. Mr. Echo Hawk is the Pawnee Nation president, a Native American attorney, tribal judge, author, activist, and law professor. He has represented Indian tribes on legal issues such as treaty rights, water rights, religious freedom, prisoner rights, and repatriation rights. His career spans the pivotal years when Indian tribes reclaimed their land, sovereignty, and pride in a stride towards freedom. As a Native American rights attorney since 1973, Walter worked at the epicenter of a great social movement alongside tribal leaders, visited tribes and indigenous habitats throughout North America, and was instrumental in the passage of landmark laws such as the Native American Grace Protection Repatriation Act in 1990 and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments in 1994. He litigated in many of the epic struggles and has written extensively about the rise of modern Indian nations as a Native American author with first-hand experience. Mr. Echo Hawk authored In the Courts of the Conqueror, the 10 worst Indian law cases ever decided, published in 2010. And recently, In the Light of Justice, the Rise of Human Rights in Native America and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2013. Mr. Echo Hawk represented the Klamath tribe in a month-long trial to quantify Klamath Indian water rights for hunting, fishing, and gathering, resulting in preserving treaty-protected lifeways. He also represented Tlingit tribes and clans of southeast Alaska, including the Sealaska Corporation, to repatriate sacred objects and cultural patrimony. Mr. Echo Hawk has taught law at the University of Tulsa College of Law. He received Oklahoma's governor's commendation from Governor Brad Henry for professional contributions on behalf of Native cultures. In 2009, Mr. Echo Hawk received the Federal Bar Association's Judge Sarah Hughes Civil Liberties Award for civil rights work in the Oklahoma State University's Distinguished American Indian Alumni. Now, it can be Mr. Walter Echo Hawk.
Thank you, Kurt. Would it be possible to put some of your introduction in the chat box so that people who might have missed it could read it as Walter speaks? Good morning, Mr. Echo Hawk. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And good afternoon to everyone. I'm so honored and privileged to be here with you. And I thank Kurt for that introduction. I think it was a good one. But I appreciate those remarks. And I want to thank our NATHPO director, Valerie, for my invitation to be here with you. I am honored to be here at the 21st National Tribal Preservation Virtual Conference. You know, I've long been an admirer of the NATHPO organization and the important role that it fulfills in Indian country. And I certainly hold all of our TIPOs in very high esteem and great respect, you know, for the work that you do. You're on the front line of protecting our tribal, historic, religious, and cultural places across Native America. And, you know, this Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is really one of the few federal laws that offer any modicum of protection, you know, for our irreplaceable native places in our country. And it lays out a very powerful Indian consultation right. And each of you Shippos, you know, are versed, you know, in your tribal cultures, your tribal histories, and you're also very strong advocates for our peoples and our cultural sovereignty, you know, among our native nations. And so for that, I think all of Native America is indebted to you, and we owe you a great debt of gratitude, you know. So I feel very privileged to be among you today, even if it's virtually. And, you know, I think that our entire, you know, beyond Indian country, our entire nation, the United States of America, owes you a big debt of gratitude for protecting the indigenous legacy of the United States. So I'm just so glad to be here, and I hope that my remarks will be helpful as we look to 2021 here. What I wanted to also just briefly talk about a bit about the theme for this year's conference, resilience in a changing environment. I think this is a very timely topic because now in 2021, we do find ourselves in a changing, fluid environment now. All of Indian country is engulfed by this deadly coronavirus pandemic. And it certainly has been a dark winter of sorrow and loss, you know, among Indian country as we are losing our people, losing a lot of our elders and culture bearers. This has caused many of our Indian nations to prioritize, you know, the vaccination program that we're going through at the current moment. And I do know, for example, here at the Pawnee Nation, we put at the head of our line our language speakers, our language teachers, our chiefs, our full-bloods, our ceremonial leaders to go to the head of the line so that our culture does not fall prey to this deadly coronavirus. And so I think we're all across Indian country praying for better times ahead in 2021. And before I proceed much further, I'd just like to ask a moment, just for one moment of silence, you know, for our loved ones who have passed on. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to just halt for a moment out of respect for the ones that we've lost. Thank you. Also, politically, we are witnessing a changing environment as well, you know, as we move from the Trump administration into the Biden administration. I think it's like moving from night into the light of day. I know that, recall back on the very first day of the Trump administration, where his first act in office, I think, was to approve the permit, for the Dakota Access Pipeline, and he speeded the Keystone XL permit, and then spent the last 4 years basically dismantling our nation's environmental protections. And I think a low point here in Oklahoma was the Trump EPA, which on October 1 issued a rush order before the election, granting the state of Oklahoma jurisdiction to regulate environmental programs in Indian country in the state of Oklahoma as a result of the backlash to the Supreme Court decision in the McGirt decision, which recognized the Creek Nation reservation boundary still being intact. And so I think that the Trump EPA rushed that through without affording adequate government-to-government consultation. And in the process, the decision that, allowing Oklahoma to do that, they said Congress has plenary power to overturn all of the treaties in the state of Oklahoma. So that and the EPA decision basically effectuated the most sweeping abrogation of Indian treaties ever seen in the modern era. So from that dark period, our tribal leaders and I'm sure TIPOs as well had to navigate some very troubled times testing times to survive. We now are moving into the Biden era, and on his first day in office, he revoked the Keystone XL pipeline. And yesterday, he signed a executive order or a memorandum regarding tribal consultation and strengthening the nation-to-nation relationship between the U.S. government and our native nations. And that document reaffirms the executive order 13175 of the year 2000 to restore a robust and meaningful consultation for our Indian nations. And so I think that, and then also yesterday, a 3-judge panel for the District Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia upheld a lower court decision that basically threw out the Dakota Access Pipeline permit as well, requiring further environmental study there. So I'm thinking that we do have a changing political environment for the better at this time. And I believe that our challenge of the day for our tribal leaders and NATHPO and our SHPOs is to rise to the occasion, to be bold, and to take advantage, to seize the opportunities that may come to us, in the Trump administration. And I think one of those big opportunities that we're going to be seeing can be found in this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that I want to talk about and focus on in my remarks today. Because today truly is a historic time for Native Americans, because we now stand at the dawn of a brand new era, the human rights era. And this is true not only for the 5 million Native peoples in the United States, but also for 350 million indigenous peoples in 90 nations around the world. Because now, thanks to this declaration, indigenous peoples worldwide, including all native peoples in our country, now stand at the confluence between modern international human rights law and domestic law. And we can see out there on the horizon this brand new legal framework for defining indigenous rights, a human rights framework. And it's kind of like looking out across the plains or the prairie, you know, and we see a spotted horse coming our way. You know, it makes us feel good because we know it's bringing good things for our people. This human rights framework that I want to talk about with you comes to us, as I say, from modern international human rights law. The United Nations, in a 20 or 30-year process, finally approved this declaration. The General Assembly voted in the year 2007 to approve this declaration. The United States endorsed it in the Obama administration in the year 2010. About 150 nations around the world have endorsed this UN declaration, making it the new order of the day. This declaration that I want to talk about, it basically shows all nations of the world how to meet their human right obligations to indigenous peoples. It lays out in 46 articles a comprehensive human rights framework that discusses the content of human rights for Native people. And it provides minimum standards that all nations should provide in doing that. And then it asks each nation to implement these standards into their domestic law and policy in consultation and partnership with indigenous peoples. And so the challenge then for us at our generation of Native people is to urge and fully implement these UN human rights into the domestic law and policy of the United States. So this is truly a historic time for us. And legal scholars say that we now find ourselves in one of those very rare juris generis or lawmaking moments in the history of indigenous rights in our nation, you know. So,
I'm up
so it's
front. I'm probably. Let's see, where's it?
And the reason why I think that this is a historic time in our history of Native people in the United States is that, the current legal framework for Indian country or Native America is federal Indian law. And that legal framework is entirely bereft of the human rights principle. For us here in our country, human rights have always been beyond reach, you know, throughout our legal and social history. And if you look into the Supreme Court cases that define federal Indian law rights and responsibilities and relationships, the Supreme Court, beginning in the Marshall era, has expressly eschewed looking at considerations of justice or morality. They said we can't get engaged in debates over justice or morality when defining the rights of Native people. We just have to apply the law as we see it, which was then the law of colonialism. So our legal framework, as it evolved, expressly, it was an amoral framework with no mention of human rights or human rights precepts. And so now we are getting this opportunity to inject the human rights principle into our legal framework. And indeed, Native America now is poised to begin the work of a social justice law reform movement to implement these human rights into our legal framework. And this is going to be one of the great social movements, a mother of all Indian country campaigns. It's going to take all of us to work together to implement these human rights standards into American law and policy. It could be the work of a generation, and there will be a role for the NASPO organization and the SHPOs as we go forward. And so this is a historic time, and what I want to do then with my remarks that I have is, first of all, I want to define what are human rights. And then secondly, I want to give a quick overview of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly those articles in that declaration that affect the work of our SHPOs. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk a little bit about what NASPO can do in the coming social movement and what SHPOs can do to support our march into the human rights era. So let me turn to my first task here. You know, what are human rights? You know, we hear a lot about human rights on TV and in the newspapers. The discourse about human rights mainly comes to us from the international realm, from the United Nations. And certainly our nation deplores human rights violations in other countries. We're willing to go to war to punish violators of human rights. But really, what are human rights? I know that many lawyers in the United States were not necessarily familiar with human right parlance or practice. We have a Bill of Rights here in our country. Why do we need to look to human rights that come to us from the international realm? And many people don't like to be bossed around here in Oklahoma, for example, by the UN. So I want to try to give you a definition of human rights and underscore that human rights really are as American as apple pie. But I would define human rights as, quote, the fundamental freedoms and rights that all human beings enjoy as a matter of right in the place where they live. And the contents of specific human rights are elaborated on by international law. That is, the norms of customary international law that emerge from the practices of nations around the world, as well as the human right treaties and declarations, you know, agreements among nations in the field of federal Indian law, which is really a rapidly growing field of international law since World War II. But what I want to stress here is that while human rights may seem somewhat alien to many Americans at first blush, if you take a second look at it, as we're going to do now, we'll see that these human rights notions and precepts truly are American as apple pie. Because here in the United States, we have a very long and proud human right heritage that sort of defines our nation. The forefathers or founding fathers of the first generation of American leaders in the Republic, the young Republic, were very well aware that there are certain natural rights that come to us from a higher source that no nation can take away. And they were variously described as natural rights or the sacred rights of mankind. But they're sort of like natural law concepts that were well known back then. And in the Declaration of Independence, for example, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are the rights, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to pursue these rights, governments are instituted among men, serving their just powers from the consent of the governed," So these are human rights is what they're talking about. And it was the denial of those rights that prompted the American Revolution. And so our nation was birthed in human rights. It was a human right revolution that arose from the denial of those rights by Britain. And so as our nation was founded, these principles animated and defined our nation. And at every historic juncture during the rise of and growth of our democracy, expansion of the democracy to end slavery, the women's movement, civil rights movement, these human right precepts were on the lips of our people at every juncture in our history. And even though we haven't always lived up to these core values, they were certainly impugned by slavery, by the treatment of indigenous peoples, colonialism. They were contradicted by inequality against women, undermined by racial discrimination and so forth. But in each of these instances, these core values impelled our Americans to self-correct, and so these human rights are really homegrown concepts, and we have a long heritage of them. But it is unusual to think about human rights for Native Americans, because as I mentioned, this is kind of like a new and radical idea, because as I mentioned earlier, our legal framework is entirely bereft of the human right principle. You can look in all of the cases, you ain't gonna find any human rights principles or precepts or any human rights discourse in our cases in federal Indian law. And so we really are governed by an amoral body of law. It has no morals in it. Justice is absent from it. And it has a high tolerance for injustice. And so this is a time to change that. And so let me turn next here to looking at this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I would first ask, who all has read this document? If you haven't read the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, let me urge you to go to your computer and download it and read it. It's a very historic document. It's one of those rare documents that come along once in a great, great while, you know, that really are ignite great change, you know, and this is one of those kinds of transformative documents. But briefly, the Declaration, as I mentioned, and it's very hard to overstate the importance of this landmark development in international law, but it lays out minimum human rights standards to protect the world's indigenous peoples, our dignity and our survival and our well-being. It took the UN about 30 years to make it. And indigenous peoples went to the UN and worked on it. They had their input shoulder to shoulder with the ambassadors of all of the world's nations. And so this document really does reflect the authentic aspirations of the world's indigenous peoples. And it's landmark because it's really the first time that indigenous peoples accessed the United Nations and were involved in the making of a standard-setting document. And it's really the first time that international law is actually now becoming accountable to indigenous peoples, because in the past, international law stripped Native people of their rights through the law of colonialism. And so now we're coming full circle where this declaration is trying to restore those rights that fell by the wayside during the colonial era. The contents of this UN declaration, there's 46 articles in it, and it establishes a comprehensive standalone legal framework for defining the rights of Native peoples on a human rights basis. And of course, in the law, a human right is one of the strongest rights that you can have, because they're the kind of rights that no nation can take away. They're inalienable rights, indefeasible and indivisible rights that no nation can take away, just like the right of against slavery, the human right against torture, human right against genocide. And now these rights in this declaration are among those kinds of very strong legal rights. The declaration says that these are inherent human rights. That means that we already had them as Native people, but they were beyond reach, you know. As I say, these aren't new rights to Native people, but they're the kind of rights that the rest of humanity already takes for granted under modern international human rights law, this notion of self-determination, the rights of culture, rights of language, rights of freedom of religion, environmental integrity, self-government, protection of cultural and historic places, rights of repatriation. These are all addressed, all of the issues that come across our desk as tribal leaders, they're all addressed in this human rights document here in this new human rights framework. And so I think at the heart of this document is our familiar self-determination principle, and the rest of these 46 articles elaborate on what that means in terms of our lands and our cultures, our environment, and all of our other aspirations that we have. They're all in there. This is a comprehensive document. But because this is merely a declaration, it remains to be implemented by every nation. And it calls upon, say, the United States to implement these principles into U.S. law and policy in partnership with Native people. And so that's the challenge, I think, of the day. And as far as the articles in this declaration, there are a number of them that that basically are very relevant to the work of SHPOs and very relevant to the goals of the NATHPO organization. And I think that I want to go through some of them with you. I think you'll see that these lay out some very valuable tools for the work that SHPOs do, and could be put to use, you know, in your day-to-day work, possibly, you know. So let me take a look at some of these here, and I want to get the these articles out, basically, if you got a pencil, I would invite your attention to look at articles 11, 12, 13, 15, 18, 19, article 26, 28, and 32. And you'll see that it will put us on a new vista of possibilities, human rights possibilities here in the work that we do. Let's see, Article 11, for example, it deals with repatriation and other items. But in subsection 1 of Article 11, I'm just going to read it. It says, Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. In Section 2, it requires states shall provide redress through effective mechanisms, which could include restitution with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent, and in violation of their laws and traditions and customs, you know. So these are NAGPRA kinds of human rights. Human rights. Article 12 talks about freedom of religion as an inherent Indigenous human right as well. And it says that Indigenous peoples, and this is relevant to your work, that Indigenous peoples have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, ceremonies, the right to maintain, protect, and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites, and so on and so forth. And it requires the states to create effective mechanisms to protect these rights in consultation, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples. So this falls right down the alley of mitigation measures that you're involved in a day-to-day basis here. Article 13, the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. This is at the heart of your work. It states that inherent human right is Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, and philosophies, and that states shall make effective measures to protect that and to ensure that Indigenous peoples can be understood in the political and legal and administrative proceedings where necessary to protect these matters. And that again falls within the kinds of works that you do as well. Article 15 says that Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, and histories and aspirations, which will be appropriately reflected in public information. Article 18 is spot on, I think, with the work of SHPO, you know, because it goes beyond consultation. In Article 18, it says that Indigenous peoples shall have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves, to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting or implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. So that any federal undertaking that would affect your people, you've got the right to participate in that decision-making process as a human rights matter, which I think goes beyond the Indian consultation right of Section 106. Same thing in Article 19, that the states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples. I'm going to insert SHPOs here. Concerned through their own institutions in order to protect their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. So this just goes on and on. It talks about rights to lands, traditional territories used, owned, and traditionally used, that states have to protect them. In Article 28, it lays out there is redress for damage done to these lands and resources without the free, prior, and informed consent. Article 32 lays out environmental and consultation rights. So these are all very go right down our alley, I think, as SHPOs, you know. And so I think that if these rights are implemented into U.S. law and policy, this would basically mean that much of the work that you do is human rights work, and that you would be relying upon and be assisted by very strong human right, legal grounds and duties that the government owes, you know, to your Indian nation. So I think there's very strong reason for SHPOs to be educated about this UN declaration, for the NATHPO organization to be an advocate that our nation develop a national plan in consultation with Native people to implement these human rights into our legal framework, and become a part of our march to justice into the human rights era of federal Indian law and policy. Because as I mentioned earlier, we stand at the dawn of this human rights era. It's a historic moment for all of us as we gather at the foot of the mountain. And I think that it is a daunting task to climb this mountain. It could be the work of a generation, but Native America has faced these kinds of campaigns in the past, along with, say, Black America, you know, in their stride towards equal protection of the law, in Native America's campaign for self-determination. And now we're about to embark on a human rights campaign, social justice and law reform movement here. I know that across Native America, we've seen a self-education project by NCAI, the Seventh Generation Fund, different tribes and tribal leader gatherings, to learn about human rights. Up in Canada, the First Nations are very conversant with human rights, are upon the lips of all of the tribal leaders up there. And in fact, in the fall of 2019, British Columbia passed a law endorsing the UN Declaration and requiring that all of the laws of British Columbia be aligned with the Declaration. And that's the first law in North America. It provides a legislative model. And I know that there's a bill pending in the Canadian Parliament that would do that on a national basis as well. And so we have a national model out there for North America. In 2019 and 2020, in the United States, the Native American Rights Fund formed a joint national project with the Colorado University School of Law to implement the Declaration here in the United States. And you can go to your website and let's see, where is the address on that? They've put this national project on a website, and you could go to UN-declaration or at narf.org to see the website of the national project to implement the Declaration into U.S. law and policy. And they've just come out with a very large document, a tribal implementation toolkit for all Indian nations, all of our tribal leaders, tribal council people, tribal attorneys, and tribal members to learn about this declaration. And the national project is calling upon all Indian nations to pass a law, just like British Columbia had done, endorsing this declaration and calling on our states and the federal government to do the same thing. So we are working, well, I think in 2021, we will see a tribal legislative movement afoot to pass tribal laws endorsing this declaration, from which we will then move to the national level. And so I think there's a number of things that NATHPO could do my first recommendation would be for NATHPO to get in touch with the national project. John Echohawk and NARF staff attorney Sue Noe at the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado are heading the NARF portion up. Contact them at NARF. At the CU Law School, Kristen Carpenter is the point person at the law school there. And she would be the other contact person. Of course, she's one of the law professors there. She's also a UN official on the human right mechanism at the United Nations. And she works under James Anaya, who's the dean of the law school there, a leader in international human rights law, native indigenous human rights law. So this is a national project that NATHPO could possibly team up with and support this national effort through your work. It may be that NATHPO could pass a resolution for your organization to support this declaration, to call upon the United States government and the Biden administration to sit down with indigenous peoples and develop a national plan to implement this declaration into U.S. law and policy, and to pledge your support for this national project, and to reach out and work with the national project as we go forward on this human rights campaign. Another thing that NATHPO could possibly do would be to form a human rights work group or task force that could possibly take the point in working with the national project here, and to look at the human rights application to the work of our SHPOs, you know, and flesh that out in more detail. As far as the SHPOs, I think that I would urge each and every SHPO to learn about human rights and to use human rights in your work that you do, to study this UN declaration and maybe figure out different ways where you can incorporate that in your advocacy in protecting native places, possibly to advise your tribal governments about the need to support human rights in the work that you do. And I'm sure that as you can be foot soldiers in this campaign to inject the human rights principle through your work that you do. And so I think that this is a very exciting time in our country, and it's an exciting time in our legal history. I think the year 2021, I hope is going to be a lot better than 2020. You know, I think that we do stand at the foot of the mountain here in recovering from the Trump era, restoring our consultation rights, restoring our nation-to-nation relationship with the United States, and now entering into the human rights era. These are big tasks of the hour. Nothing important or worthwhile is ever easy to obtain. It takes toil, sweat, and tears. And the same is true for human rights, you know, because rights are never freely given. They always have to be demanded, wrested away, and then vigilantly protected. And that's the essence of freedom. And so I think that's all very true, you know, for the to implement the human rights of Indigenous peoples, you know, in this UN declaration. And so I think it's, I wanted to try to use my time here with you, you know, to let you know about this human right, the dawn of this human rights era, to issue a call to action, I guess, if I could, if I may. I know that you're very, very busy in the important work that you do, and I hope that this would add a dimension to strengthen your work that you do for all of us. And then I want to invite NATHPO and each of the SHPOs to come along on this campaign, you know, to secure human rights for our people, that we might all someday soon stand in the light of justice. So with that, I think concludes my remarks. And I don't know if I'm out of time totally, or if there's room for any questions or not, comments or questions, but I'm certainly available for that at this time, you know, as long as the questions are easy ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Echohawk. And we've had questions coming up in our chat. And you're right, you took us like right up to 10 o'clock when our next topic starts. So your timing is impeccable. But if you have time to stick around and maybe go through the questions in the chat and, you know, and maybe just type some answers to people, I think that would be terrific. And we can also share those with you later if you want to have an opportunity maybe to respond, and we can share the answers with everybody.
I would, I'm not able to do that. I'm just here. I'm just on my little flip phone.
Oh,
I can't, I've tried to access chats, on this, actually it's on my iPhone, but I can't access the chat part, so.
right. Gotcha. Okay, well, we can send those to you. I mean, honestly, I feel like we could have a session all day long just with questions and comments. But thank you so much for your support and the rallying cry of us all working together to get this recognized by the United States and moving to really have it be more than just words on paper.
Yes. Well, that's certainly been my honor and my privilege, and I thank you for my opportunity to be here. And as I say, I've always admired the organization and certainly have deep respect for each and every one of your members. Shippos are tops, in my books, for the work that you do. And it's very important work. I commend each of you and hope that the Great Spirit, will be at your side in the work that you're doing for all of us. I thank you.
Thank you, Nicham.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so